You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa. Top of the day to all our Sacred Sofa listeners. We are firmly in the dog days of summer now, and we hope everyone is finding some rest and rejuvenation as of late. This summer at the Sacred Sofa, we are airing pilot episodes we taped before the launch of the Sacred Sofa.
Today is an unusual one, as we are putting God on trial by revisiting a familiar but disturbing Old Testament story, Abraham offering Isaac as a sacrifice. It is a grisly tale, but we hope this episode will help you rediscover it with fresh eyes. Enjoy.
So let's jump into a story that is not an easy one, and we'll see what we can mine from it. But we're exploring at Nexus tensions with God, and one of those is how it can be hard to trust a God when we read stories like in the Old Testament of God apparently asking Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. So that is no easy story. Leon Cass writes that there's no story in Genesis as terrible, as powerful, as mysterious, as elusive as this one. It defies easy and confident interpretations and continues to baffle me. So this is a story that lots of people have wrestled through. So we tried to take a stab at it. But anyway, there's always questions to be had. But it was a fun one to preach and dive into. Yeah, do you remember this story growing up? Is this one that ever sort of rocked you a little bit?
Absolutely. So I've been here in terms of the bafflement, the puzzlement. I grew up in church, and so I've heard this story so many times throughout my faith journey. But it didn't become real to me, Brad, until I had my first child. And I remember wrestling with this idea that God would ask me to give up something I held so precious. You know, my first child was quite new. I literally had sleepless nights just wondering and wrestling. And so I finally went and asked my pastor about this. Like, what could this really mean? Especially if this were a literal interpretation I'm supposed to be taking from this narrative. And I also remember that I realized as an adult that he gave me kind of half an answer. So he said by the time Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham had walked with God for so many years and had built a trust in this God who would then demand a sacrifice, and his belief that, you know, God would also keep their promise about extending Abraham's lineage. Somehow God would work it out. And so, sure, there's some trust been built, but I'm still thinking, what kind of loving God would ask such an incredible and terrible? So I was left puzzled. There was some comfort, but there was still this uneasiness about this type of God seemingly represented.
Yeah. And I mean, even when you think about human relationships, whether it's a friend or partner that you've built trust with over years, there's still something very disturbing about the person we trust most in life asking something disturbing of us. And we might think, okay, maybe this will work out in the end, but it's still, it calls into question the character of anyone who would test you by way of something grisly. So I get that. And I think you're right. As a parent, this story takes on a whole new sort of tension for us, because I would like to think that if anyone heard a voice asking them to kill their child, they would check themselves in to a mental institution. I mean, we would have no patience for that kind of thing today. So this is certainly a difficult story. But as I mentioned in my sermon, there's a lot of interesting clues when you start to get into this story that maybe things are not quite as they seem, and maybe this story is not as straightforward as God asking Abraham to do this. So, of course, you can go in and listen to that sermon at any time, but I have a few things that I want to jump in and particularly ask you from a therapeutic lens, and
Hmm.
you holler back if there's something you want to jump on. But one of the very telling signals, I think, in the story is that 4 chapters before this incident takes place, God asking Abraham to kill his son Isaac, is Abraham does some serious bartering with God over the cities
Hmm.
of Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, it is read on the page, it is very bold what
Mm-hmm.
Abraham says to God. Far be it from you to do something wicked, and he's bartering, gets God down from 50 to 10. Anyway, it's a fascinating scene. And I think one of the troubling aspects of the Abraham Isaac story is that when Abraham hears this voice asking him to sacrifice his son, Abraham is silent. He does no bartering. And I'm just curious, when you look at, I don't know, this story, knowing that Abraham had jumped in before to defend innocent people and now no, is there anything that jumps out to you about that?
I appreciate that, or Abraham's boldness at the
Mm.
beginning in this
Hmm.
encounter, bargaining with God. That takes some strength. And I would
Yes.
say, submit again, trust to say, okay, let me just challenge this, decree that's come down from the divine. And
Mm.
I've heard it speculated and preached that Abraham stopped at the number 10 because that's the amount of family he had in the city.
Okay.
So he was just trying to secure his own lineage, I think,
Right.
in terms of getting down to that number.
Yeah.
But to your point, you know, family in this city, but hundreds and hundreds of people potentially going to be laid waste to. He bargains down to 10, but then his own bloodline, direct bloodline is at risk. And there's this odd silence. So I'm a little perplexed about that too, Brad. Is it
Mm.
because he trusts that because of the previous encounter where God agreed to the 10, that he just is riding that trust wave and saying, oh, you know what? You know, I think Isaac's going to be okay. This
Yeah.
happened. I was able to negotiate. And so maybe
Mm.
Isaac's just going to be okay. It is fascinating. But, as a parent, I don't know that I would sit there and not say something in
Hmm.
that direct moment. It's like, excuse me,
Yeah.
am I
Yeah.
hearing correctly? Something, some,
Right.
yeah. And I can only imagine what happened to Isaac in that moment. It's
Mm.
like, hey, this is happening to me, and you're silent here, which I've sat in spaces with many of clients who have been harmed by family members, and other family members stay silent. I
Mm.
was recently talking with a client this week, and there's this very fascinating psychology when it comes to abuse. We can readily raise our voice when we see, strangers being abused, sometimes young children. We seem to have this category with people out there. But when it comes to family, there is somehow this excuse, more
Mm.
grace. Like there's just something that hinders us for taking a stand to say no to abuse by family members. I
Mm.
don't know what that psychology is. I don't know.
And
Somehow we give an excuse
huh.
for it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because to me, when you look at the whole arc of Abraham's story, he's a very complicated character, actually.
Mm,
And there's moments, he's where he tries to pass off his wife Sarah as his sister. There's some really cowardly moments in his
mm,
story. And so
mhm,
it's not a cartoon character where, very, I don't know, always brave, always strong. We see
mhm,
in Abraham a humanity able to stand up to God in one moment, acting as a coward the next moment. And
mhm,
so there's something strange going on here. But what I appreciated about, and I was working a lot off of Richard Middleton's book, Abraham's Silence,
mm,
and he's just lining these things up and going from a narrative point of view. we, the reader, are supposed to raise our eyebrows at this story. It's not like, oh, see,
Absolutely.
this is what you do when you're a person of faith. It's like, oh, wait, hold the phone here. Something
Hmm.
strange is going on. So there's also, I wonder, I know you probably know a bit about the bystander effect. Tell
Hmm.
us, do you see that at play at all
Hmm.
in this story, where it's maybe, I don't know, the shock of the request is just causing Abraham to be silent? I don't know.
The bystander effect is this concept and idea and lived experience of seeing tragedy unfolding, let's say bullying,
Hmm.
and having the inability to intervene.
Hmm.
And I what I love about so much of the scripture is it highlights our humanity, especially in this narrative we're talking with Abraham and Isaac. As you read through this narrative, there are so many points where I believe we can see ourselves
Hmm.
in. There's a value that is so strong in us that we would readily speak up to see the opposition of that value, but that
Hmm.
there are some values that maybe we don't realize the strength and importance of them, that somehow quiets our voice. But then
Hmm.
we have to also understand that when fear and anxiety enter the scene, we move into instinct. It's not logic anymore.
Hmm.
And so, if it's one student, let's say, being bullied, you know, you may feel powerful and empowered to intervene. If it's two or three against one,
Hmm.
then the dynamic has changed and you begin to wonder, do I have the ability to intervene in a way that still keeps me safe?
Uh,
And we can speculate accordingly towards Abraham. 10 I can ask for, but
hmm.
one,
Hmm. Interesting.
perplexing.
Yeah. There's also, I mean, we take this into the realm, a bigger realm, but I'm curious about the ways we, obviously not in the literal way we see in this story, but ways we as parents are maybe willing to sacrifice our children to some things I've been thinking a lot right now about the challenge parents have to deal with in trying to navigate smartphones and social media with
Mm-hmm.
their children, and yeah, I'm just, or stories I've heard of. You already alluded to this. I know I have many friends grew up in a certain religious tradition that became very abusive, and you can't help
Mm-hmm.
but ask yourself, where were the parents? Why didn't they step in? And it's like there can become you're blind to it almost. You
Mm-hmm.
don't quite see the harm. And so yeah, there's so many layers to this story, but I think what Middleton points out, for him, this is the strongest piece of evidence that something is amiss in this story. The other one being, I should mention it quickly, that the actual name of God in this story, Yahweh and Abraham talk often, but it's Ha Elohim is the name of the God that asks Abraham to do this. That to me is actually a huge piece of evidence that something, maybe Abraham is struggling to understand the difference between Yahweh's voice, the actual voice of God,
Mm-hmm.
and some other voice, because child sacrifice was actually quite common
Mm-hmm.
in this time. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibilities that Abraham would expect that this is what a God would want. So
Right.
that's going on. But for Richard Middleton, the biggest piece is the absence of Abraham's family
Mm-hmm.
at the end of this story. It seems as though Abraham has lost everything, builds up this family over the years, walking in relationship with God. But by the end of the story, he looks like a lonely man.
Mm-hmm.
Isaac's nowhere to be found. Sarah's nowhere to be found. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's a family breakdown, it would seem. And I'm curious sometimes if you see this or know anything about this, if as parents we can hold to something so tightly that we end up losing our family in the process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And sadly, I see that often or too often in my practice, adult children now processing the brokenness of a family. This speaks to me not only of Abraham and Isaac, but it can highlight again ourselves in this story in terms of our beliefs and values. Beliefs, although they're often subconscious, they're like an app. They run in the background in our minds, but
Mm.
they 100% influence the way we see the world, we see ourselves, we see the world around us. And I believe from Abraham's belief system, you talked about culturally, child sacrifice was a known practice. From Abraham's belief system, I suspect he attributed that to Yahweh.
Mm.
Is that, this is the thing that gods do, is
Mm-hmm.
demand a child sacrifice. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but in his journey, he hasn't realized yet that that is not Yahweh's nature. And so
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine that his belief system influenced his behavior as well as his non-action. There's a metaphor graphic I often use called the belief wheel.
Mm.
It starts with our belief, and then from that belief, we make judgments. So Abraham believed that God was like other gods, sacrificing children. So he made a judgment, and that influenced the action and also the non-action he took.
Right.
And then the results of that either reaffirms the belief or eliminates that belief, and you
Mm.
start with a new one. In
Mm.
Abraham's case, his action and non-action resulted in estrangement from his family,
Mm-hmm.
brokenness in his family. And if we put ourselves into this story, this is a call to re-examine what are our beliefs and values when it comes to family. So many families are broken due to seemingly noble pursuit, but that leave partners, spouses, children behind.
Mm.
So it's important to consistently reevaluate and challenge not only what we believe, but why we believe. What are our goals, hopes, and dreams? Why are
Mm.
they important? What is the cost of this pursuit?
Mm.
I don't know anyone who gets to the end of their life, Brad, and regrets working more,
Right.
right? If only I
Right.
just did one more overtime shift. I don't know
Yes.
anyone, right?
Yeah.
But I do many a family who face regret from misconnections and relationships in rubble. And
Mm.
so this to me is a call to reevaluate what are our beliefs and values, not only about family, but in this narrative as well about God. Who do we
Mm.
believe that God is?
Yeah, and that's an important one because I think, yeah, again, what we see in this story is just that I think all of us have a vision of the good life and what we're
Mm,
meant to serve, like you were talking about. What is our vision here? And it's easy for that to block or get in the way of relationships.
mm-hmm,
How does this, Grace? What should we? Well, let me ask you straight up. Should family, children be always our number one priority? Are there ever times where there's something where you might be like, you know what, this is a busy time. I do need to put in more time at work and sacrifice a bit of family time. Like all these questions start coming up for me, like how do you best maintain a healthy relationship with your children?
mm-hmm.
That's a big one.
That's a big one. That's a big one. I think we also have to admit that we need grace as humans.
Hmm.
I think it's a day to day struggle at times with
Mm.
balance.
Hmm.
The reality is most folks have to work, right?
Yep.
And then
Yep.
there are some situations where there are single parents. And so the pressure in terms of bringing
Mm.
income and stability and safety and security for children is going to require the work piece, for example, or studying to get a better job and income. It's going to push it off balance. And having open communication with said children, especially as they get older, to understand, to help them understand why. Because here's the thing, children will see certain behaviors and one automatically self-blame or
Hmm.
make their own interpretation of what they're seeing. And so, as the adult or parent or guardian in the situation, having regular open communication, okay, you're going to be with Auntie so and so while I'm working this night shift, you know, open communication, I think will help in those type of circumstances. but a constant evaluation of, okay, can I, trust God, especially as a person who walks in the faith, to fill in some of those cracks, surrounding myself with village and
Mm.
community to offset some of those deficits, if we want us to use that word, is so important. It's a moving target for sure. It's a moving target.
Well, that's just helpful to me right there. You talking about maybe communicating. I'm just realizing as you're talking how frequently my kids. I work from home. I'm
Mm,
on my computer a lot.
mm,
Emails. There's different sorts of work I do, but then of course there's also okay. I'm guilty of flipping through Instagram or whatever,
mm, mm,
and uh, even just you speaking there is helping me realize that my kids don't know the difference, and
mm,
maybe communicating, okay, what is, okay, dad's in his office, what is he actually doing, how is this work, what's this serving,
mm,
and is that different than, oh, dad's chuckling at a funny Instagram thing, like maybe all that becomes enmeshed for them. And I think as parents sometimes we don't, what seems obvious to us
mm,
might not be
mm,
obvious to children. And I want to back up and ask a question you mentioned there,
mm,
that a child's first inclination is maybe to self-blame. I think I
mm,
heard you correct
mm,
there.
mm,
That's a bit of a scary thing for parents, right? To assume
mm,
that
mm,
if they're being ignored maybe by their parent, that their first inclination is to blame themselves, as
mm,
opposed to go, oh, you
mm,
know, parent is busy doing whatever. I think
mm.
that's good for us parents to know.
Hmm. When we think about child development, right, they're very self absorbed and for a
Mm,
reason, right? They're
mm-hmm,
dependent on the guardian to provide the things that they need. And then over child development, they start to see the world outside of themselves,
mm,
in a healthy progression. And so in those early years, the children are seeing and observing things that they're taking in, in terms of their own blame, or, oh, if only I wasn't making so much noise, daddy wouldn't have dot dot
mm,
dot. Or,
mm,
it's very important for parents, especially in light of a separation or divorce. One of the things we encourage parents to make sure they're talking about is letting the child know it's not their fault.
mm,
Somehow, children always seem to want to blame themselves when a relationship breaks down. And so
mm,
imagine them observing me in my office, on hours at an end, PD day.
mm.
Hello, where is mom? Is she coming out?
Right.
Those things are so important to have conversations with our children. And again, go back to, what are my beliefs and values about family, about work? It's possible to have more than one healthy, important value, but
Mm,
how do we balance all of them?
right.
The
Well,
metaphor I keep of is those, remember back in the old days of carnivals with the plate spinners?
yeah, yes, yes.
you
Got to
know,
keep them all.
we got to keep them all spinning. And one, how many plates do I have spinning?
Mm,
Yeah, is this actually manageable? And then where am I prioritizing what's on those plates? Which plates are
right.
going to be in rotation? Constant reevaluation and reassessment.
Yeah, and I like that as a metaphor because it helps us. You can't have 13 big values that you're going to try to keep spinning. Something's going to get dropped. Can you
Mm-hmm.
manage two, three, in healthy balance? I absolutely. I think that's feasible. But even just as you're talking, it's making me think of all these things that we need to address, particularly today. For instance, with more and more of us working at home, I wonder if the balance or the line between what's work and whatnot. Like for instance, when I grew up, when my dad came home, he went to work, went away. When he came home, it was obvious when work hours were done. He worked
Mm-hmm.
in a trade, so it wasn't even like, oh, he's got emails to do in the night. It was get home, that is done. Today, that's much more fluid.
Yes.
We're kind of working, even if we have an office, there's still emails to respond to, maybe. And I wonder about what the impact of that might be on children when they don't quite know, maybe, is
Mm.
my parent working, are they, I'm just, those things are just being flagged in my head as I listen to you here.
It's actually work that I work with clients do. I call it an activity audit. You know, The socialization belief system is to be productive, which translates really to be hyper productive. You
Hmm.
know, that's the socialization, especially we as Westerners have experienced. And we sort of get on this treadmill and start taking off. And it's really hard to reassess, okay, I'm really exhausted. Why can't I get off of this treadmill?
Hmm. Yeah.
And, you know, to your point, when so many folks are working virtually now, or remotely now, I actually work with clients and say, can you? So when you were working out of the home, there was a commute period. And then when you commuted back home, there was a time to decompress from whatever was happening at work. When you're working from home, that's not organic anymore. It has to
Hmm.
be intentional. And so we talk about, like, can you work in an office and actually be able to close the door at the end of your work shift? Can you use your devices to actually remind you that, you know, using things like out of the office notifications, not only a boundary for yourself, but the boundary for clientele. I'm not
Hmm.
in the workspace at this time.
Hmm.
So close the door is a boundary and a barrier, you know, for folks who don't have a room separate. You know, we've talked about even having like a towel to lay over the laptop. Like
Hmm.
visually, you're shutting down from the workspace and then entering your home space. But even putting in your schedule that decompression time you would have had with a vehicle commute to recenter your brain to enter the home life. So we talk about these new boundaries that are necessary to create more balance.
Yeah. And that all seems like worthy stuff to consider, because stuff like this happens to me all the time. My kids get home from school at 3:35, and it can feel like that, right? Where you got to switch
Mm-hmm.
modes sometimes. But
Mm-hmm.
and when we get into a couple of weeks from now, I'm getting into, well, it actually starts this Sunday, but the tensions we deal with ourselves. And I want to get into more of this stuff, because I think a lot of this is real challenges for people today. But in terms of, again, this story, to me, the ultimate tragedy is that we have a family torn apart at the end of it. So it's good to get into family dynamics here. And one of the things that I find really curious is later on in the Genesis account, Jacob, who's the grandson of Abraham, son of Isaac, is reflecting. He's making an oath one time through the name of his grandfather Abraham, and
Mm-hmm.
he talks about God as the fear of Isaac. And it's just this little signal. But later on in the account, you get this idea that what Isaac inherited from Abraham, from his father, was that God is to be feared, full stop. This is a
Mm-hmm.
scary God. And of course, with this story, you can understand where that might come from. Your
Mm-hmm.
God asked you to kill me, but it makes me really curious about the notions we pick up from our parents, our
Mm-hmm.
guardians, ideas about God, but even beyond that, ideas about life. But this idea that Isaac inherited just a fear. And in my line of work, I deal with a lot of people going through deconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
Not in every, but in a lot of cases, I would say people deconstructing, you dig a little bit deeper, and there also tends to be
Mm-hmm.
maybe some parent issues going on, and
Mm-hmm.
having a bit of a difficult time maybe differentiating between the way our parents treated us, or how our parents
Mm-hmm.
raised us in faith or otherwise. If they were harsh with us, maybe we think of God as harsh.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you deal with that a lot in your work, but is there a way to help people sort of separate that my parents are not God? And I know that sounds simplistic, but that my
Mm-hmm.
view of God might be tainted by how I see my parents.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's a big one. That's a big one, Brad. It occurred to me as we talked a little bit about which voice was Abraham listening to. There's a message there for us too, in terms
Mm,
of wisdom and discernment. Who are and what are the voices we're listening to that create the belief systems that
mm,
we then operate under in our lives? And it's the same in terms of influence of parents on children. My professor used to say, our home of origin is the oven we're baked in.
Hmm.
And I like to make my banana bread, and that smell permeates the house, and all those ingredients mixed together creates this beautiful loaf of bread. But society is giving us messages. Media is giving us messages. We're getting influences and socialization from so many different influences and places. And part of our role as parents is to pay attention to what are those influences, and then how am I mirroring that, modeling that for my children. It's a huge responsibility as parents, not only to be self-aware and discerning, but then what messages am I saying overtly and covertly to my children? I work with a lot of families in terms of intentional parenting. We do an exercise where it looks back at, it's a keep, toss, add exercise. As I view how I was parented, what are the things I want to keep? What are those values? What are the ones I want to toss? And what are the ones that I want to add because I believe they were missing in my experience? And it's amazing and satisfying to watch families sit with that exercise. And one, they realize there were so many benefits, but then also holding space for some grief where it's like, that should have been, or I wish it could have been, but isn't. How do I then be intentional about that so my child doesn't have that same experience? And I could see that woven throughout this narrative with Abraham and Isaac. As parents, we're going to miss things. We are. And with safe community and a village around us, those things will be less because there will be, positive, healthy voices, we hope, speaking into our lives to offset some of those things that we as humans may miss. And so, absolutely, there is a space and necessary deconstruction for all of this, whether it's our spirituality and faith or the social life and influences we're living day to day.
Well, I've got lots to just ask and chat about there. I was just thinking that keep, toss, add exercise, just how important intention and awareness is. Because if I came in to see you, Grace, and you asked me that question, I can't tell you precisely what I think the values were that my parents held. I just haven't really thought about it. And I think that's a worthy exercise right there, going, okay, what in hindsight, what do I think were the values there? What do I want to keep? But then on the flip side, I think a lot of us parents are maybe parenting on autopilot. And again, there's got to be grace because we're there's lots of stressors, but I don't know, it might be a good idea for anyone in any capacity, but as parents to say, what are our values? And let's allow that to guide us. And it brings me back to the story, because if we're not intentional about trying to discern what we're doing, it's easy to hear external voices that might not be the best voices to be listening to, and to allow that to shape us. We're on autopilot. I'm big on the Jesus path idea, and this idea of a path, right? That if we don't set ourselves on a path, by default, the path will be set for us.
Absolutely.
And so that sounds like a fantastic exercise for any parent, guardian to go through. What I want to keep, what I want to toss, what I want to add. That's a great takeaway right there, Grace.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like that.
Fascinating story, but so many lessons to be, if we view the text with curiosity rather than criticism. I think there's a lot of things to be gleaned from this narrative. Absolutely.
And there's always so much more we could talk about, but I think we've probably gotten at least down to a level that gives us all something maybe to consider and take away. So excellent. Thanks for chatting with me about this, Grace. I appreciate it.
Great chatting with you too, Brad. We'll see you soon.
Take care.